A federal high court has ordered the Nigerian Army and the Chief of Army Staff to suspend the ongoing Operation Positive Identification by the Army. And the Senate has declared the NDDC interim board as void after it rejected the nomination of Dr. Joy Nunye as a member of the board of the NDDC, but confirmed the nomination of the chairman, Mr. Odubu, and 14 others. Hello everyone and welcome to the program. This is Politics Today live on Channels Television. I'm Sean Kimbaloye in Lagos. President Muhammad Buhari has approved the appointment of Dr. Sarah Alade as a special advisor to the president on finance and the economy. Domiciled in the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Dr. Alade retired from the Central Bank of Nigeria as the deputy governor in 2017 after spending 23 years at the Apex Bank. She had also acted briefly in 2014 as the CBN governor. Let's also tell you that the Senate today says that the interim steering committee of the NDDC, inaugurated by the Minister of Niger Delta Affairs, Senator Godswill Akpabio, is now void. The Senate President said this after the conclusion of the screening of nominees for the board. The Senate President says the interim board ceases to exist after the confirmation of the board. He wants a speedy inauguration of the screened members of the board. Senate, however, rejected the nomination of Dr. Joy Nunye as a member of the board of the Niger Delta Development Commission, NDDC. The nominee, who was to represent Rivers State on the NDDC board, was rejected for failing to appear before the Senate Committee on Niger Delta for screening. The upper legislative chamber, however, confirmed the nomination and of the chairman, Mr. Odubu, and 14 members of the NDDC board. During today's proceedings, the Senate also confirmed the nomination of Justice John Soho as the Chief Judge of the Federal High Court, as well as Justice Benedict Kaib for appointment as the President of the National Industrial Court of Nigeria. Let's now move to our main conversation for tonight, everyone. And it's about the popular Operation Positive ID. A federal high court in Lagos has ordered the Nigerian Army and the Chief of Army Staff to suspend the ongoing Operation Positive Identification by the Nigerian Army. Justice Ruwan Aikawa ordered both parties to maintain status quo ante pending the determination of a suit filed by Senior Advocate of Nigeria, Mr. Femi Falana. Mr. Falana, a rights activist who filed the suit marked October 25, is seeking, among others, an order stopping the operation. The Chief of Army Staff, the Army, the Attorney General of the Federation are forced to third respondents in the suit. When the matter came up today, November the 5th, none of the respondents were in court. Mr. Falana informed the judge that the respondent had been served with processes and the proof of service was in the court's file. But a principal legal officer from the Ministry of Justice, Mr. Adebayo Mokolu, asked the judge to grant an adjournment to enable the Solicitor General, Mr. Dayo Apata, to handle the matter personally and also give the respondents time to harmonize their positions. Justice Aikawa granted his application. He adjourned further proceedings to November the 18th. Before we go into that conversation, because, of course, the army did say there's nothing to fear about the Operation Positive ID. The fact remains that they say, look, this is very important going into the end of the year because of the fight against Boko Haram and terrorism in the northeastern region of the country. And the fear is that some of these insurgents are fleeing the northeast to some other parts of the country. And that's some of the reasons the army gave for the Operation Positive ID. But Mr. Falana has gone to court. Mr. Falana spoke on this program last week to give reasons why he went to court. We shall be discussing that. And my guests are in our Abuja studio, Mr. Bish Johnson, a former United States Army captain and a security consultant, and also Mr. Daniel Bwala, a lawyer, to give some legal perspective to this. Take a moment, everyone. Take a breather. We will take a break and get to listen to some other political stories that we have for you on our political roundup.
Nobel laureate Professor Wole Soyinka has called on the federal government to, as a matter of urgent national importance, take decisive action against Boko Haram, armed herdsmen, and the Islamic State of West Africa, who are terrorizing Nigerians unabated with reckless impunity. He also faults the border closure policy of the federal government without first encouraging local manufacturing and cottage industries that will meet up the gap created by the closure, leaving Nigerians and the economy to suffer. Ahead of the November 16, 2019 governorship election in Kogi and Bayelsa states, the Center for Citizens with Disabilities is asking the Independent National Electoral Commission (INEC) to protect the rights of people living with disabilities. Addressing a news conference in Abuja, the executive director of the center, Mr. David Anyele, also expresses concerns over the security and safety of the physically challenged persons who he claims are oftentimes disenfranchised.
If there's a time for them to look into it, it is now.
The Jigawa state government is to begin the payment of the new minimum wage next year. This was confirmed by the state governor, Badaru Abubakar, today while presenting the 2020 appropriation bill to the members of the Jigawa State House of Assembly. According to him, 77 billion naira is earmarked as the current expenditure out of the 152.92 billion naira budget.
Let's get to it, everyone. Some of the things that the military says they want in this Operation Positive ID is that, one, the demand identity cards from citizens across the country to combat threats of insurgency, banditry, kidnapping, and other crimes. The exercise is expected to run from November the 1st to December the 24th, 2019. The Nigerian Army will meant to stage a show of force in selected locations across the country. Troops are to operate mostly on streets and highways, and Nigerians are urged to maintain situational alert on some of these situations. The military says it's because of the fleeing insurgents from the northeast region of the country to other parts. That's why they're staging the Operation Positive ID. Let's get my panel tonight to weigh in on this one. Let's hear from the expert who is a former military officer in the United States Army, Mr. Bish Johnson. Is it a standard procedure, especially in fighting insurgency? There were a lot of ad hoc and extra strategic moves made by the United States government after 9/11. And so a lot of people will think that when the army makes some of these moves, a lot of things are probably not known to an average Nigerian. The issues of national security. Is it standard practice? Is it something that is familiar to your years or to your experience in your years of practice as a military officer?
Shehu, good evening, and thank you for having me this evening. For me, this is not a familiar experience because, as you are aware, there is nowhere in the United States of America where you use regular soldiers in internal security. Unfortunately, that is the situation we have in the country now. I've been one of those opposed to that, positive identification because I felt that you cannot profile an entire nation because you're looking for a few individuals. You do that, there's going to be a lot of resentment. You're going to cause a lot of anger. Identification. More than half population of this country don't have any form of government issue ID card. So I believe that at this time, our effort should be focused on how to get every Nigerian into the identification process, so that everybody have a form of government ID. Now, having said that, and looking at what is on the ground right now, what the army is doing at this point in time, I don't see any change from what they have been doing in the previous years. There are no additional troops. They didn't deploy additional assets, and there are no additional checkpoints. It appears that it's still the same type of exercise they have been doing in the previous years. I think what the problem was this year was because of the way it was rolled out. There were no proper awareness or education to explain to Nigerians that, look, you are not going to see any change. It will be similar to what we have been doing in the past. So I think this is
Mr. Johnson, kind of apologies. Let me butt in quickly. Mr. Johnson, you are probably one of those who have said the military need to change tactics. The military need to show more creativity in the way and manner in which they tackle this issue of insurgency. A lot of things that are of national security are not in the public domain, are perhaps not the things that you put out there. And when the military says this is perhaps one of the strategy for us to fight these insurgents, is it counterproductive for citizens to now fight back? Because they say, in fact, it's going to be seamless. A lot of citizens wouldn't even know that this operation is going on.
Yeah, sure. Like what I've said earlier, I don't see any change in what the military is done from the previous years. I mean, from the perspective of an ordinary citizen who is going about his normal duty, nothing has changed. There are no additional troops. There are no additional checkpoints. There are no more assets that are deployed. It's same thing as what the military has been doing in the previous years. For that, I can't oppose that. I don't have any disagreement with that. We feared when this program was being rolled out, because they said it was going to be a nationwide exercise. There would be additional troops, additional checkpoints. And so some of us, felt that, look, if we go that route, we are going to cause a lot of disruption in people's life, and we will make more enemies than we had intended to do. And that is not the best strategy for you to deal with insurgency.
All right, Mr. Johnson, let's bring in Mr. Bwala, and let's get some legal perspective to this. Mr. Bwala, is it a blow for the fight against insurgency? You are, interestingly, from the northeastern region of the country. You perhaps, when you go home, you see some of the implications and effect of the insurgency in your area. Security is perhaps the biggest duty of government. From what has happened, from what the court has said today, how much of blow do you think this is for the military?
Well, first of all, I think we need to put in context what the court said, because the caption says the court orders the suspension of military operations. That is actually not what the court said. The court ordered for the maintenance of status quo, because the army has not commenced the operations, as it were. But anybody who sees it would think as if matters were argued in court and the court consequently made an order. In fact, the army was not even represented in the first place. As someone from the Northeast, I don't have a problem, army operating within the Northeast, to identify people for the purposes of maintaining law and order. But the Constitution empowers the president to deploy the army, not just for external security, that is not just for the territorial integrity by stopping external aggression, but the president can deploy the army into limited operations within the country. For example, in helping in humanitarian cases, and in other cases where, for example, the police and other law enforcement agencies are being overwhelmed by the crisis situation in a particular place. It may seem that that is not the scenario in the South. That is why the argument for the limitation of the operations of the military in the South is tenable, but in the North it's not the same. But you see, and it seems that like the army is trying to encroach on the jurisdiction of the Nigerian police and the Department of State Services, because if you look at the National Securities Act, Department of State Services is the one that is saddled with the onerous responsibility of maintaining internal security of the country. More so, when the military said their operation is intelligence in nature. And that is the reason why, in my opinion, the army did not give a proper information to the Nigerian people to understand that if it is on intelligence gathering,
All right,
there'll be less of arms and armories on the street and even the stoppage of people in the highway.
apologies,
And
Mr.
once
Bwala,
we say it is intelligence,
to butt in because we need to take a break. But when we come back, I'll come back to you. And there is a critical part of this conversation that the public needs to know in what we are seeing in the country. We are in a war situation as far as the terrorism issue is concerned. But that's going to be a conversation when we come back, everyone. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us on the program. So we're talking about security, perhaps the biggest role of any government across the world. And so the military said it will embark on what it called Operation Positive Identification. And the reasons are so. They're given their reasons to the National Assembly, to Nigerians, saying these are the reasons by which we wanted to conduct this exercise because of fleeing terrorists across getting out of the northeastern region of the country. This is some of the things that you need to know about the Operation Positive ID. But today, the court says that both parties in the suit filed by Mr. Femi Falana should maintain status quo. Tonight, we've been discussing this matter. Mr. Bish Johnson is a retired U.S. Army officer and a security consultant. And Mr. Daniel Bwala is a lawyer, giving us some legal perspective to it. Let me get back to Mr. Bwala. Mr. Bwala, it's indeed a special situation that we are in the country, is it? Because we are in a war situation. The country is faced with terrorism, and that is not that's not a joke. It's not a usual situation. For the military, do you think this could be, this civil or legal action or legal move from the citizen could be some kind of frustration to their efforts?
To be quite frankly, to be honest with you, I don't have a problem with the military operations because first, it is defined. And secondly, it has a time lag. And thirdly, it is not militarized in nature. These three factors should give peace to the Nigerian people. Now, is anybody in Nigeria living in Nigeria who cannot attest to the fact that we're in a crisis situation? That somebody, even in a broad daylight, in his own house, will be kidnapped by kidnappers? That somebody before the noonday, before the evening, people are being kidnapped in schools? What about the cases of armed robbery? What about the cases of insurgency? These same people who are fighting limited military operations for the purpose of eternal peace are the same people that will go to the town market and begin to cry that the Nigerian situation is so bad and the president is not doing anything about it. If the army is going to be deployed into the territories within the country to carry arms or to block citizens, then I will oppose to it. But if they say it is a mere engagement that is devoid of militarized operations, I don't think it has caused a reason for us to go to the market and start crying wolf. More so, it is at a critical period in Nigeria that everyone knows around that period you have increased rate of insecurity in terms of kidnapping, armed robbery, and all of that. They've been doing that in the past. People in the Southeast have attested to the fact that these various operations, Operation Python, dance and all that, sort of, to a large extent, limited the number of kidnappers, the rate of kidnapping, and some of this. So why is our apathy towards the government so bad that every act of the government is being misconstrued? Let me tell you, Sheun, these the military operations, even in America, the president of the United States can deploy the U.S. Armed Forces in the United States to perform limited operations such as disaster, and in a situation where in a state the security apparatus is almost being overwhelmed. Why are we creating a mole out of a mountain, is a mountain out of a molehill in Nigeria?
Mr. Bwala, weighing on the premise with which Mr. Falana went to court, Mr. Falana is saying that it's unconstitutional for the military or the armed forces to usurp the powers vested on the Nigerian police in the national security, and is praying that the court should restrain the armed forces and the Nigerian military permanently from subjecting Nigerians to such ridiculous harassment. And of course, Mr. Falana says that that's the reason why he's going to court. On that grounds, what do you perhaps think the military might be telling the court when there is an opening of this case effectively?
Well, the thing is that by our discipline as lawyers, we do not comment on the merit and demerit of a matter in court. But if you ask me, for example, generally, does the Constitution empower the army to operate within the country? I gave you my opinion. What about the police? Is there a conflict now between the army and the police regarding the operations? The police, by the Constitution, are to maintain law and order and public safety. The army says within so period and so period, we want to carry out an operation for the purposes of dissecting, identifying, and fishing out terrorists who have infiltrated the system. Police is not complaining. So assuming there is a conflict between the police and the army, then it will be clear that the operations of the police will override that of the army. But in order for us to be on a better footing, my opinion is that the federal government should rather allow the Department of State Services, who is tasked with the responsibility in this kind of situation, to do the work rather than the Nigerian army coming into the territory of Nigeria to try to identify. And like my friend here said, and I believe, more than 75% of the Nigerian people don't have any form of identification in terms of the national ID card and all that. If you look at Administration of Criminal Justice Act, one of the errors in the Administration of Criminal Justice Act is that it says the police can stop you at any time and ask you to explain your whereabouts, your address, and your means of livelihood. And if you fail to do that, you can be charged to court. That is one of the problems in the Act. So in my view and in my opinion, to be honest, let the Department of State Services and the Nigerian police be allowed to carry out the operation, especially if it is intelligence-driven. The DSS is better served in this situation to deal with this kind of situation.
All right. Mr. Bish Johnson, please come back into the conversation now. What do you think, or where do you think we can go from here? Because I imagine that I'm a part of the military personnel or officials who have made that strategy, and they're seeing this kind of brick wall. How do you think that the military can permeate or can maneuver into the civil arena when they have these kind of tendencies on their hands, especially when you're fighting an insurgency that has a nature of guerrilla and civil environment at its playing ground?
Shehu, before I answer your question, let me first and foremost correct one or two things. The President of the United States cannot order American regular forces anywhere in the United States. You saw the problem he had sending troops to the border between the U.S. and Mexico. They ended up sending the National Guard. There's a distinction between U.S. regular forces, the National Guard, and the reserves. The National Guards remain under the command of their various state governors, and the reserves are mostly civilians who work as part-time soldiers, so you can't really take them as regular forces. The martial law in the United States prohibits the president from deploying American regular forces anywhere in the United States. Now, having answered, let me come back to your question. You see, the way the army could have succeeded in doing this thing very well is if they allow, like my friend rightly pointed out, they allow civil authorities, maybe the DSS or the police, to drive these kind of operations. What I understand that the responsibility of the army in this country is territorial integrity of the country. However, they can be ordered into a supporting role by the president and commander-in-chief. And what he says is supporting role. But in most of all these instances, the army is not in a supporting role. As a matter of fact, the army is in a leading role. So I would suggest that next time they want to embark on this kind of exercises, they should try and liaise with their civil counterparts, the DSS, the police, on whose jurisdiction majority of these internal security matters fall under their purview, liaise with them, have an understanding with them, and let the police or the DSS drive these kind of operations. And they have said that it's intelligence-driven. If it's intelligence-driven, you cannot provide the entire population if it's intelligence-driven. If it's intelligence-driven, what you do is to narrow your intelligence down, go into where the intelligence leads you to, and surgically extract whoever you want to extract from that environment.
Let's close the program, Mr. Bish Johnson. We're out of time. But in one sentence each, both of you, what would you advise the president to do to pull back that action in one sentence for each? Mr. Bwala?
Sheun, the U.S. Army is called the United States Army, and they comprise of both the regular force and all of these other ones. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, and even the recent one in Houston, Texas. The President of the United States ordered the U.S. Army to go and help in the limited
we're out of time.
in relief, providing of relief materials. So I will advise the President, quite frankly, to allow the Department of State Services and the Nigerian police to coordinate this. But where there is credible intelligence that is a militarized activities of insurgent in any part of the country, you can then involve the Nigerian army.
Mr. Bish Johnson, President should put them back or what?
The components of the United States military that are being deployed.
I don't want us to go into that debate because we're out of time. My director is telling me that I need to close the show. I need to thank both of you, Mr. Bish Johnson and Mr. Bwala, for your thoughts tonight on the program on the issue of Operation Positive Identification. Well, that's our show for tonight, everyone. Many thanks for watching. I'm Sean Kimale. Bye-bye.